She was the kind of woman people either feared or admired. Isabel Monroe, CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in New York, had built her empire from nothing. A woman in a man's world who didn't just compete, but dominated. At 31, she was already a name whispered in boardrooms and printed on the front of business magazines, polished, precise, and untouchable in every sense. She had rules, strict ones: never mix emotion with business, never let anyone too close, never risk her image for something as fleeting as feeling. On the night her company officially went public, a rooftop celebration unfolded under the city lights. Champagne flowed like water. Industry giants and influencers surrounded her, all wanting a moment, a photo, a favor, but none of it moved her, none of them mattered. Her longtime friend and co-founder Avery leaned in during a quiet lull between conversations, his voice low, his eyes sharp with challenge. "You've conquered everything," he said, "but when was the last time you felt something real, something not attached to numbers or contracts?" Isabel raised an eyebrow, amused but unmoved. "Love is an illusion," she replied. "Feelings are liabilities." Avery smirked, lifting his glass. "Then prove it," he said. "Not with a billionaire, not a partner, or someone from your world. Pick someone who doesn't even wear a watch, who doesn't care who you are. Spend one night with someone you'd never let into your office." She followed his gaze to the far end of the rooftop, where a janitor moved silently, collecting discarded glasses and napkins. Unnoticed by the crowd, his uniform wrinkled, his hands rough, his movements efficient. He didn't glance around, didn't try to fit in, and somehow that made him stand out. "You wouldn't dare," Avery added, eyes glinting with playfulness and provocation. Isabel turned back to her drink, then slowly back to the janitor. She hated being challenged and hated losing more. "One night," she said quietly. "If I feel anything, even a flicker, I'll admit, defeat deal," Avery said, raising his glass. She clinked hers to his. To her, it was just another game, another test of her own emotional immunity. It didn't matter who the man was or what his story might be. She was sure no one like him could ever shake her. She had always been in control of her image, her time, her desires. Nothing got through the armor she had built over the years. But what Isabel didn't know was that this man, this janitor she thought was invisible, wasn't someone she could simply use to prove a point and forget the next morning. She didn't know that behind the silence and rough hands was a mind as deep as hers, and a heart that had known pain far greater than most. She didn't know that one night would unravel everything she believed about herself, because some bets don't end when the night ends. Some keep echoing through the days and months that follow, changing the rules and breaking the walls we thought would never fall. And that night, Isabel Monroe would lose more than just a game. She would lose the one thing she had guarded more than her wealth or power, the one thing she had promised to save for someone who would never exist in her world. She would lose her certainty, her armor, and for the first time in her life, she would feel what it meant to truly give something that couldn't be taken back, not her body, but her heart. Isabel Monroe was the kind of woman who made people sit straighter when she entered a room. She walked with precision, spoke with clarity, and built her empire with a level of discipline that frightened her competitors. Born and raised in Manhattan by a family of diplomats and financiers, she was groomed for success, educated at Yale, sharpened at Stanford, and refined by Wall Street, before she ever dreamed of launching her own company. At 31, she was the CEO of Virginity Technologies, a data security firm valued at nearly $1 billion after its explosive IPO. The media loved her, industry veterans respected her, and rivals feared her, not because she played dirty, but because she played clean and still won. But behind the spotless suits, behind the curated interviews and tailored power walks, Isabel lived in a glass fortress, unreachable by affection, untouched by emotion. Her success had come at the cost of connection, and she wore that sacrifice like armor. She had never been in love, never allowed anyone close enough to see the fractures behind the image. People often assumed she was cold, perhaps even heartless, but the truth was simpler and sadder. She had learned early on that vulnerability was a currency too expensive to afford. In contrast, Ethan Carter lived in shadows, a quiet man in his mid-30s with a calm presence that went unnoticed by most. He cleaned offices and conference rooms after hours, moving through glass towers when the city slept. His world began when others ended theirs. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands shaped by work, Ethan had a face that carried silence, the kind of silence built from years of enduring more than he shared. His eyes were kind, not in a soft way, but in a way that said he had seen enough suffering to know where to place his compassion. He had once been on a very different path, accepted into medical school. He had dreams of becoming a trauma surgeon, but life had other plans. His mother's cancer diagnosis, the crushing medical bills, and the choice between saving a future or saving her life had rewritten his direction. He dropped out, took multiple jobs, cared for her until the end, and never returned to the life he had left behind. Now he worked nights as a janitor, not because he lacked ambition, but because ambition no longer ruled him. He lived simply, read often, and believed in kindness more than success. Their worlds were so far apart, they might as well have existed in different universes. Isabel's penthouse overlooked the skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows and curated minimalism. Ethan's one-bedroom apartment in Queens had second-hand furniture, lined bookshelves, and a coffee maker older than he was. She was followed by media, attended by assistants, flanked by security. He moved alone, arrived silently, and left before sunrise to most people in her building. He was invisible, background noise in a system that ran too efficiently to notice the gears beneath it. But fate, or something stranger, had plans. It was after midnight when Isabel finally walked out to the rooftop where Ethan was finishing his shift, trash bag in one hand, spray bottle in the other. She approached him with the kind of confidence that had closed billion-dollar deals. But there was a hesitation behind her eyes, a flicker of doubt she hadn't felt in years. Ethan looked up, surprised but calm. He didn't straighten, didn't rush to greet her, just met her gaze as if she wasn't someone on magazine covers, but simply another human being. Isabel spoke first, her voice composed but curious. "You always work this late?" He nodded. "The night's quieter. People are gone. Less mess." She stood there, unsure why she wasn't walking away, why she felt the weight of his words settle deeper than expected. She asked his name, and he told her, "Ethan." Nothing more, nothing less. He didn't ask hers, didn't pretend to be impressed or interested in who she was, and that unsettled her in a way she hadn't anticipated. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that stretches just long enough to become meaningful. The city breathing around them, traffic below like a distant hum, stars lost behind skyscrapers. Isabel didn't know why, but she didn't want the moment to end. She didn't know yet that this man, who stood with cleaning supplies and quiet eyes, would be the first to ever see her without her mask, the first to make her wonder what it might feel like to let someone in. And Ethan, though calm on the surface, felt something stir too, something unfamiliar, something that would soon challenge everything he thought he had left behind. Neither of them could have predicted what that night would begin, a shift in both their lives, built not on power or desire, but on something they hadn't yet named. Something that started with a dare, but would end with the question neither of them had dared to ask before. What if everything they believed about love, class, and control was about to be rewritten by a single choice, made under the city's quietest hour? The following night, Isabel found herself at the office long after everyone had gone home, claiming it was to review end-of-quarter financials, though she barely looked at the reports in front of her. Instead, her mind kept drifting back to the quiet man with calloused hands and steady eyes. It wasn't attraction in the way she had known it, which was often calculated and shallow. This was different, more unsettling, more real. She tried to brush it off, to label it as curiosity, but even that didn't explain the slight anticipation she felt when she heard footsteps in the hallway. After midnight, she waited until he appeared again. Pushing his cleaning cart past her glass office, she opened the door and called out, "Ethan!" He stopped, looked up, and gave a small nod. She gestured toward the empty conference room. "I owe you coffee." It was meant as a joke, light, casual, but her tone came out softer than she intended. He hesitated, then followed her in. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale glow over the sleek table between them. She placed 2 paper cups down, unsure why her hands felt colder than usual. "Do you always talk to the CEOs?" she asked with a faint smirk. He shrugged. "Only when they insist." She laughed. not because it was particularly funny, but because it was disarming. His honesty unsettled her more than flattery ever could. They spoke for nearly an hour, about nothing and everything. He talked about the books he liked, Russian novels mostly, philosophical and slow. She found herself leaning in without meaning to, genuinely listening, the kind of listening she reserved only for market analysts and elite developers. He asked her what success felt like. She paused, then answered quietly, lonely. The word hung in the air longer than she expected. Ethan didn't react, didn't offer pity or comfort. He just nodded, like he understood. And maybe he did. Isabel left that night feeling something she hadn't felt in years, the echo of connection, something beneath power and polish. She began staying late more often, always finding a reason to remain when the office was nearly empty, and Ethan would always appear, never surprised, never intrusive, just present. They talked more about childhood, regrets, dreams they didn't chase. Neither admitted it, but both felt something shifting. One evening, as rain fell against the office windows, she asked him what he really wanted out of life. He thought for a moment, then said, peace. Not wealth, not recognition, just peace. She didn't answer, because deep down she wasn't sure she'd ever known what peace looked like. That night, she invited him up to the executive lounge, a sleek space at the top floor rarely used by anyone but her. He hesitated, then followed. She poured them whiskey, the city lights spread beneath them like a galaxy of ambition and loneliness. She asked him if he believed people could really see each other, not the roles they played, but the person beneath. He said yes, but it was rare. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy, charged with everything unspoken. When she reached for his hand, it was slow, uncertain, not like a CEO taking what she wanted, but like a woman asking to be known. He didn't move away. They stood like that for what felt like a small eternity, two people on opposite ends of the world, standing in a room neither of them truly belonged to. Then she leaned in, and for the first time in her life, she didn't calculate the consequences, didn't think of image or control. Their lips met, hesitant at first, then with the quiet urgency of two people who had long forgotten what it meant to feel wanted. She didn't stop it, not when her heart began to race, not when her body trembled, not when fear flickered in her chest, and when the night deepened and she let herself fall into something that felt terrifyingly close to trust. She didn't resist. In that moment, she didn't feel like Isabel Monroe, CEO, billionaire, icon. She felt like a woman who had spent her whole life locked behind walls and finally found someone who didn't try to tear them down, but stood patiently outside, waiting. When morning came, she expected regret, expected the flood of doubt to return, but all she felt was silence. Ethan was gone before sunrise, and beside her lay a folded note, handwritten in neat, careful strokes. You don't owe me anything. Thank you for letting me be real with you. She read it twice, then folded it back, placing it against her chest. For someone who had spent years building a fortress of logic and control, it was the most vulnerable she had ever been. That entire day, she floated through meetings with a weightless kind of calm. She didn't tell Avery what happened, didn't speak of the night, not because she was ashamed, but because it felt too personal, too sacred to explain. But Avery noticed something in her eyes, a quiet shift, a softness that hadn't been there before. You look different, he said, and she just smiled, not confirming, not denying. She didn't know then that Ethan had already made the decision to disappear. He had seen the walls in her eyes begin to crack, and he feared that what happened between them was a moment, not a beginning. He told himself he had done the right thing by leaving, told himself that people like her didn't fall for people like him, but even as he tried to resume the rhythm of his quiet life, something inside him refused to go silent. And Isabel, despite everything she told herself about control and logic, found her thoughts returning to the man who had spoken so little, but made her feel so much. Neither of them could sleep peacefully, both haunted by the same question. What if one night was more than just a night? What if it was the start of something neither of them dared to dream? Isabel waited for Ethan the next night, telling herself it was coincidence that she stayed late again. She had meetings, reports, updates. There was always a reason to remain in the office after hours, always a reason to hope she might hear the familiar sound of the cleaning cart in the hallway. But when midnight came and the hallway stayed empty, she felt something unfamiliar: disappointment. The next night passed the same way, then the next, and slowly the realization began to settle. Ethan was gone. She asked around casually, first the security team, then the maintenance manager. No one seemed to know much, only that he had requested a transfer. The paperwork was processed quickly. No forwarding address, no contact. Isabel sat alone in her office that Friday night, the city glowing beyond her windows. And for the first time in years, she felt something heavy pressing against her chest. It wasn't panic, or shame, or confusion. It was loss. And it stunned her how real it felt. She hadn't expected anything from him, not truly, not a relationship, not promises. But she also hadn't expected him to vanish without a word, not after what they shared, not after the look in his eyes when he held her like she was more than just power and polish. Her thoughts drifted to that folded note he had left, still hidden in her drawer. No apology, no excuse, only quiet gratitude. She wondered if he had felt something more and simply didn't believe he deserved it, or worse, believed she didn't mean it. The irony was sharp. For someone who had spent her life being pursued, admired, chased for her title, Ethan was the first man who ever left her before she could leave him. That weekend, at brunch with Avery, she barely touched her food, he noticed. Naturally, he always did. "You look like you lost something important," he said gently. She didn't respond. Then after pause, she asked him something she never thought she would. That night on the rooftop. Why him? Why Ethan Avery looked at her, serious now. Because he was the only one up there who didn't look at you like a prize. He looked like he was just surviving, but not desperate. He looked real. Isabel sat back in silence. She had chosen Ethan to win a bet, but somewhere along the way, the game had stopped feeling like a game. She began to wonder if her actions, no matter how quietly she had changed her intentions, had already caused damage that couldn't be undone. The next Monday, she asked her assistant to pull personnel records, nothing invasive, just the basic file, job application, resume, anything. What she found made her pause. Ethan Carter, 34, listed no social media, minimal work history, but one detail stood out. His college history pre-med program, Columbia University, 4. Non-zero GPA, first 2 years, then a sudden withdrawal. No explanation, no record of return. It didn't fit the narrative she had built around him. Janitor by choice, simple life, humble background. Later that evening, she opened her private laptop and searched deeper, cross-referencing databases only accessible to corporate partners and investors. Finally, she found something surprising. A decade-old grant program, started by her mother, for underprivileged but exceptional high school students. One of the first recipients had been Ethan Carter. Her chest tightened as she stared at the screen. She remembered the name faintly, remembered a young boy who had come to one of her mother's charity dinners, awkward in a suit too big, quiet, intelligent, polite. She hadn't spoken to him directly, but she had seen him. She remembered now how she had once mocked the idea of helping people who would never belong in her world, how she had rolled her eyes when her mother insisted on mentoring students like him. And now, all these years later, that same boy had stood before her as a man, not asking for help, not begging for attention, just existing in her world without apology. It hit her then, hard and sharp. This wasn't just a man she had misjudged. This was someone whose life had been indirectly touched by her family, someone she had seen and dismissed without knowing, someone she had once laughed at quietly while sipping champagne in a designer dress. The shame burned in her chest. Isabel leaned back in her chair, the office silent around her. She realized now that the story she had created in her mind, the one where she was in control, where she was the powerful one extending grace to a man beneath her, had been false from the start. Ethan had known who she was from the moment he saw her. Maybe not in full, but enough. And still, he had treated her like a person. Not a symbol, not a status, not a bet. And she, in return, had reduced him to a dare. She stood from her desk and walked to the window, looking down at the city far below, the weight of realization settling over her like a storm. For the first time, she didn't feel like the woman on top of the world. She felt like someone who had missed the most important truth because she was too blinded by image and pride. The next morning, she went to the foundation office her mother had once run and asked to see any archived correspondence from past students, old letters, thank you notes, anything with Ethan's name. The assistant, after some searching, returned with a thin folder. Inside were 2 letters. One was a handwritten thank you note, dated the year he received the grant, neat and thoughtful, thanking Isabel's mother for believing in him when others didn't. The second was dated 3 years later, after his mother passed away. It was shorter, heavier, and ended with the line, "I'll never forget what your support gave me, even if I couldn't finish what I started." Isabel read that line over and over, the weight of it pressing against her chest. He had carried gratitude, not resentment, even as life had taken from him more than she could imagine. She knew what she had to do. She didn't know where he had gone, but she knew how to look. She contacted private investigators, asked them to search quietly, respectfully. She wasn't trying to control him. She just needed to find him, not to ask for forgiveness, not yet, but to offer something real. Something she should have offered the first night they spoke. Honesty. It took nearly 2 weeks before she received a call. The investigator had found him working at a community clinic in Brooklyn, volunteering part-time, living in a modest apartment above a bookstore. His life was quiet, intact, far from the noise of the city. She didn't go to him that day. She waited, afraid of what she might say, or how he might look at her if he saw her again. But deep down, she knew she couldn't stay silent forever. The woman who had built a life on power and precision was now standing on the edge of something far messier and more uncertain. Something that might finally teach her what it meant to be seen, not for what she built, but for who she was beneath all of it. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to face that truth, but she knew she couldn't keep running from it either. The following week passed in a strange rhythm. Isabel spent her days pretending everything was normal, attending meetings, reviewing contracts, making high-stakes decisions, yet her mind remained fixed on a single name and a modest address tucked away in Brooklyn. She rehearsed what she might say if she saw him. She told herself it would be simple, a conversation, an apology perhaps. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't seeking closure. She was seeking permission to admit that something real had happened that night, something she hadn't planned, hadn't expected, and certainly hadn't prepared for. She went on a Thursday afternoon, dressed not in her usual designer suit, but in something less structured. A dark coat, simple pants, no makeup, no jewelry. She took the subway instead of a car, walked the last 3 blocks by herself. It was raining lightly, and she didn't carry an umbrella. When she reached the small bookstore that sat beneath his apartment, she paused at the door, unsure if she would go in. The window displayed worn novels, handwritten signs, and a faded poster of a charity drive for the local clinic. She stepped inside and found the space warm and quiet, the smell of paper and time surrounding her like a memory. Behind the counter sat an older man with glasses who looked up as she entered. She asked if Ethan was upstairs. The man nodded, slowly, said nothing else, just returned to his book, as if visitors came often with questions they didn't know how to ask. She climbed the narrow stairs, each step heavier than the last. At the top she found a hallway, with only one door slightly ajar. She raised her hand to knock, but froze when she heard a voice. Soft, steady, familiar. Ethan was reading aloud to someone, a child by the sound of it. The book was old, a classic fairy tale, his tone gentle but animated. She stood there, listening, uncertain whether to turn away or step forward. When the story ended, she knocked lightly. The door opened slowly, and there he stood, just as she remembered. Maybe, a little more tired around the eyes, but still Ethan. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her, as if trying to understand whether she was real or a thought he had tried to forget. She finally broke the silence with a whisper. "Hi." Ethan nodded once, moved aside and let her in. The apartment was small, clean, filled with books and a few drawings pinned to the wall. A girl about 10 sat at the table coloring. He introduced her as his niece. Staying with him for a while, Isabel smiled and waved, The girl waved back, then excused herself politely to her room, leaving them alone. They sat at the kitchen table, silence lingering between them like a question neither of them wanted to ask. First, finally, Isabel spoke. I found your letters, the ones you wrote to my mother. His expression didn't change, but she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. I didn't know back then. I was a teenager who thought compassion was weakness. I never saw you, not really, not until now. Ethan looked down, tracing the rim of his mug with his finger. You didn't have to come. I wasn't expecting anything. I didn't come because I felt guilty, she said quickly. I came because I finally understand what it means to feel something that can't be negotiated, and I'm sorry I treated you like a question I had already answered. He looked at her then, eyes steady. You think you hurt me? You did, but not in the way you believe. I never expected someone like you to fall for someone like me. I didn't expect love. I expected respect, and that's what I didn't get. His words cut deeper than she anticipated, but she didn't flinch, I understand. Maybe not fully, but I'm trying, and I want to keep trying. Ethan stood and walked to the window. The rain had grown heavier, blurring the city beyond. You think this is about class, about the job I do, but it never was. It was about truth. I showed you who I was, and you turned it into a bet. She stood too, moved closer but kept a small distance. I thought if I could control everything, I could avoid ever feeling weak. I didn't know that the only way to be strong is to let yourself be seen. He didn't respond, just looked out into the gray sky. She took a breath and said, quietly, I didn't come here to win you back. I came because I can't go back to the person I was before you, and I'm not asking you for anything except a chance to show you that. Ethan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he said, I don't want to be a chapter in your story of personal growth. I want to be real, or nothing at all. You are real, she said. You're the first real thing in my life I didn't buy or build. They stood there for a long moment, the rain softening outside, the silence less sharp, more open. Finally, Ethan nodded slowly. One conversation, one walk, no promises. She smiled. That's more than I hoped for. They left the apartment, together, walked down the street beneath a shared umbrella, the city quieter now, the air clearer after the rain. They talked as they walked, not about the past, but about things they loved, books, music, how they took their coffee. It was ordinary, but after everything, the ordinary felt extraordinary. He didn't touch her hand, she didn't reach for his, but something unspoken passed between them, something more fragile than forgiveness, and stronger than regret. That night, Isabel returned to her penthouse with no plans, no expectations, just the memory of the sound of his voice and the warmth of a quiet walk that didn't need to be anything more than it was. She looked out over the city, the light still blinking with ambition, but her reflection in the glass was softer now, less certain maybe, but more alive. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, not for a perfect ending, but for something real, something that couldn't be built in boardrooms or bought with stock options. A connection made not through power, but through presence. And she knew, whatever came next, it wouldn't be written by fear or pride. It would be written by choice, one honest moment at a time. The days that followed were slower than Isabel expected, quieter too. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions, just a rhythm that built itself out of small choices. She and Ethan continued to meet, sometimes for coffee at a quiet shop he liked, sometimes for long walks through the park where the city noise softened into something almost peaceful. They didn't talk much about that night, or the bet that had started it all. Instead, they let the silence fill in the spaces that words couldn't. Isabel found herself stepping away from things she used to consider vital. She declined invitations to galas, ignored emails that weren't urgent, let meetings run without her, not out of recklessness, but because she was beginning to realize that for most of her adult life, she had confused motion with meaning, achievement with fulfillment. She began spending time volunteering at the same community clinic where Ethan worked, not as a figurehead or a donor, but as a person who wanted to help. She started simply, filing papers, organizing supplies, cleaning exam rooms. It wasn't glamorous and no one cared about her title, and strangely, that was what made it matter. At first, Ethan kept his distance professionally, letting her find her place without interference. But slowly, the walls between them lowered again, one shared task at a time, one genuine laugh at a time. The people at the clinic didn't see them as two people from opposite worlds, they saw them as a team. And, over time, so did they. One evening, after closing time, Isabel sat on the clinic's back steps sipping cheap coffee from a paper cup. Ethan joined her without a word. The sky was fading from gold to gray, and for a moment they just sat, side by side, watching the city breathe. "You're not who I thought you were," he said eventually. She glanced at him, then looked away. "I'm not sure I ever knew who I was," she replied, her voice low. "I spent so long trying to be perfect that I forgot how to be real." "You don't have to prove anything to me," Ethan said, his tone gentle but firm. "I didn't fall for the CEO, I fell for the person behind the glass, the one who laughed too loudly that night. We talked about bad poetry, the one who forgot to be impressive for 5 minutes and just ice was." She smiled, the memory softening something inside her. "I still don't know if I deserve any of this," she said. "Maybe that's the point," he replied. "Maybe love isn't about deserving. Maybe it's about being brave enough to show up when it's hard." That night, when she returned home, she stood in her penthouse and looked around at everything she had built, the art, the view, the silence, and for the first time, it didn't feel like success. It felt like distance, like a beautiful prison she had created to protect herself from everything she was now starting to want. The next morning, she made a decision. She called Avery, asked to meet in person, and over lunch at a quiet place far from their usual power spots, she told him the truth. About Ethan, about the bet, about how wrong she had been. She expected him to react with judgment or sarcasm, but he didn't. He just listened, and when she finished, he leaned back and said something that stayed with her long after. "Maybe this was never about proving anything to anyone. Maybe it was about you finally finding something that doesn't need to be conquered." A week later, Isabel stood at a small podium in the community center, announcing a partnership between Virion and several local clinics. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a tax strategy. It was a commitment to give technology, resources, and funding to the neighborhoods that had been forgotten by the cities they helped build. She spoke from the heart, without notes, and when she looked into the audience and saw Ethan standing near the back, arms crossed, a quiet smile on his face, she felt something stronger than pride. She felt peace. They didn't rush anything after that. Their relationship grew in quiet ways, shared meals, walks home, small acts of kindness that weren't meant to impress, but simply to connect. They learned each other's habits, flaws, fears. Ethan never asked for more than she could give, and Isabel never pretended to be less than she was. There were moments of conflict, moments when her instinct to control resurfaced, moments when his silence felt too much like retreat, but each time they returned to the foundation they had built, honesty without demand, presence without pressure. One night, while watching a documentary together, she turned to him and said something she hadn't planned. "I never thought I'd be the kind of person who could be loved for who I am, not what I do." He looked at her, eyes steady, and said, "You were always that kind of person. You just never let anyone stay long enough to show you." The words settled between them like a promise, not of perfection or certainty, but of effort, of intention. As the months passed, Isabel found herself dreaming differently, not of expansion or acquisition, but of balance, of waking up next to someone who knew her not as an empire, but as a person. She kept running Virion. But, with new perspective, she built more flexible structures, invested in education and mental health, stepped out of the spotlight when it no longer served her or her people. Her world didn't shrink, it deepened. And Ethan, for his part, never asked her to change. He simply stood beside her as she did. He continued his work at the clinic, continued reading the same slow novels, continued believing in quiet good. And Isabel realized that the greatest strength he had wasn't what he endured, but how he endured it with softness intact. One afternoon, as they sat in the bookstore beneath his apartment, surrounded by secondhand paperbacks and sunlight filtering through dusty windows, she reached for his hand and said, I want you to know that you didn't just change how I see love, you changed how I see myself." He squeezed her hand gently, then whispered, "I didn't change you, you just stopped hiding." And maybe he was right, because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop performing and start living. Sometimes the love that lasts is the love that begins when we stop trying to be perfect. And Isabel Monroe, the woman who once believed she needed no one, was finally learning how to belong, not as a brand, not as a leader, but as herself, fully and quietly, in the presence of someone who saw her long before she saw herself. The evening was warm when Isabel walked barefoot across the rooftop of her building, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, not as a symbol of power this time, but as a reminder of how far she had come. Beside her, Ethan stood quietly, hands resting on the railing, the wind brushing softly through his hair. They didn't speak at first, didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a place where understanding lived. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything. 6 months since a careless bet had become the catalyst for a truth neither of them had been ready to face. 6 months since a woman who once believed vulnerability was weakness had learned that to be seen, to be known, and to be loved for who she truly was might be the strongest thing she would ever do. Isabel reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the note he had left that first morning, the paper worn now from being opened too many times. The ink slightly faded, yet every word still etched into her heart. She handed it to him. He smiled quietly. "I never thought you'd keep that," he said. "It was the first honest thing anyone had ever given me," she replied. He folded it gently, then looked at her with the same steadiness that had once unnerved her, but now grounded her. "I didn't know if you'd come back that day," he admitted. "I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. More than I wanted to admit, I almost didn't," she said. "I was scared, not of you, but of what you made me feel." They turned to face each other fully, the city glowing behind them like a memory that no longer defined them. "I used to think I had to be everything for everyone," she said softly. "The perfect daughter, the perfect CEO, the perfect woman. But with you, I never felt like I had to prove anything. I was just me, and that was always enough," he whispered. She stepped closer, their hands finding each other without force or urgency. "You know, I've spent my whole life thinking love was something I had to earn by being more, by doing more, and you showed me that sometimes love is simply given. Not because we deserve it, but because we're brave enough to receive it." Ethan nodded, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. "I didn't save you, Isabel. You did that yourself. All I did was wait long enough for you to believe you were worth it." The wind moved around them gently, the city continued on below, indifferent and alive, but up here, in this quiet space above it all, something permanent had settled between them. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was risking anything by being close to someone. She felt safe, not because she was protected, but because she had chosen to stay open even after being broken. The past no longer held them, the future didn't frighten them. What mattered was this moment, shared and real, built not on perfection but on presence. And in that moment, Isabel Monroe knew she had not lost a bet. She had found a life worth living, a love that didn't need to be explained, and a man who had waited not for her success, but for her truth. Sometimes the most reckless decisions lead to the most beautiful consequences, and sometimes what begins as a game ends up being the very thing that saves us. Because real love doesn't demand, it invites, it doesn't judge, it sees. And when we are finally brave enough to stop running, it meets us exactly where we are. And in that quiet, unguarded rooftop, above the noise and beyond the roles they once played, two people stood, not as a CEO and a janitor, not as a woman proving her worth or a man surviving the world, but simply as two hearts, finally home. The city didn't notice, but maybe it didn't need to, because some stories aren't meant for the headlines. Some stories are meant for those who understand that the strongest kind of love is the one that teaches us how to stop performing and finally just be ourselves.